Welcome to 805 Focus. I'm Dr. Cynder Sinclair with Nonprofit Connect, and we will be bringing you the latest on your favorite nonprofits, so get ready to be inspired. Our special guest today is Ray Ford, and Ray is a longtime columnist for Newshawk writing about outdoor issues, and he has authored several books on our local hiking trails and wildfires in Santa Barbara County. Ray also is a longtime advocate for bringing all of the agencies together in a concerted, coordinated effort to better maintain and restore our local trails, and he's quite an accomplished photographer. We're going to hear a lot today from Ray. Welcome, Ray.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you offering the opportunity to come and visit.
Yes, thank you. Oh, you are such a wealth of information. And so, okay, let's start with some comments that I've heard you make about the unique topography of Santa Barbara.
Yeah, well, one of the things about Santa Barbara, and is anybody that's had the opportunity to live here has had an amazing array of things to do. A lot of that is tied to the topography, the climate, the place we are along the coast. And one of those things that I think makes Santa Barbara unique is the way that topography has formed over millions of years, from the point in time where the San Andreas Fault, the Sierra Nevada mountains and so forth, all created the ability for that part of the Pacific Plate to turn and twist and create a set of mountain ranges and coastal areas and islands that have made Santa Barbara something pretty spectacular. Yeah,
and so a lot of that includes the Channel Islands. Right.
When I used to teach at Dos Pueblos High School, I would take, one of the first things was to take a look at your right hand, and you think, how much do I know about my right hand, and how can I look at my right hand as kind of a guide to thinking about Santa Barbara and what it's like. And if you take your right hand and you just kind of hold it out and look at it, and you think about the thumb being the Channel Islands, index finger being the San Ynez Mountains, the San Rafael Mountains behind Lake Cachuma, the Sierra Madre Mountains on the far northern part of the county, and then on the other side of the Cuyama Valley is the Caliente Mountains. And that topography forms a lot of what Santa Barbara is, and it's unique in a lot of ways. One of them is just the fact that historically those mountains separated the coastal and the interior until roads, eventually a railroad, freeways and so forth could have been built to allow people to explore more of it, but still about 80%, everything that's behind Lake Cachuma, everything all the way over to the Cuyama Valley is pretty rugged, pretty roadless, it's wilderness area. So what we have in Santa Barbara is this opportunity to enjoy this beautiful coastal environment. We're at 34 degrees north. We're on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. That's created the appropriate conditions for a Mediterranean type of climate, and that's bred the more of a chaparral type environment and a much more rugged kind of environment for both interior and even along the coastline. The cliffs along the coast are as rugged as can be too. So what you have, in Santa Barbara is what I would say hundreds of opportunities to explore, and I've had an opportunity just growing up here to be able to explore a lot of that, get to know a lot of it, and share a lot of that.
So you grew up in Santa Barbara?
Well, I came to UCSB between my junior and senior years in high school. They had a program for 6 weeks of summer school to give students the opportunity to explore the campus, and it was really a way of trying to encourage the development of the campus, because at that time when I came, it was only 4,000 students.
Oh, golly.
At UCSB, and most of what we think of the structures at the campus weren't built then. A lot of it was Marine barracks and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I grew up to a certain extent with the development, the evolution of Santa Barbara campus, and then eventually, after I graduated, got a teaching job at Dos Pueblos, started to expand out and learn more about the rest of the county.
So I know you have a special interest in our local hiking trails. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that, and maybe how people that are using the trails, I don't know, can be more aware of the importance of maintaining them, being careful with them. What can we do as hikers to be more responsible?
Well, I think the first thing is just to have a little bit of an appreciation or an understanding of what's available. Now, when I was graduating from UCSB, there was an outdoor store called Dunall's. There was one of them that was in Goleta. There was another one downtown Santa Barbara. And I went in one of the days and found a book by Dick Smith. It's called, Santa Barbara Backcountry. And it basically took each one of those mountain ranges and valleys and did a chapter on what they were like. And all of a sudden, you start to realize when you see books like that, all of the things that are part of Santa Barbara you never really knew existed. And much of that is in the backcountry. And so it just kind of gave me, kind of an incentive to really want to go out. I've always been an explorer. When I was a little kid, I was running all over the place. My parents grew up in Cincinnati. My grandparents had a farm, and we were out on the farm and had the ability to explore and do all kinds of things. So immediately I started looking at some of these places and thinking, I got to find out where that is. I want to see this, I want to see that. And one of them just happened to be in the front country trails, area too. And at that time, there was no, none of the open space areas, any of that, in town that people kind of explore first. If you're in Santa Barbara, you might know about Lake Los Carneros, you might know about Parma, or even Ealing's at that point in time wasn't there, Douglas Preserve wasn't there. So when I grew up, none of that urban open space things that kind of transition kids growing up with weren't here in Santa Barbara, but the mountains were. And I started exploring them and realized that there wasn't anything out there to tell people about them or where to go or how to get there. And so I talked to Dick Smith, and he encouraged me to write a book on Santa Barbara day hikes, and that was my first endeavor. Was in 1975. It was 48 pages long. It had 8 trails, and it was the introduction for me into writing and for others into the trails themselves. But what's happened over time, though, is, and this is partly from the things I've written about, probably created some of the increased visitation. But we've gone from a period of time in the 1970s where there maybe were 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people that were on the trails to today where easily there's 500,000 people.
Holy cow.
It's day hikers, family outings, it's mountain bikers, it's trail runners. Every one of the trails, for the most part, has huge numbers of people on them. I mean, if you start thinking about it, may not seem that much, but I was writing a story about Jesucita Trail and some of the issues that are there, and thinking 10 mountain bikers came down. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot. Well, if they were scattered during the day, you might not ever have seen a mountain bike, and maybe during that period of time, 60 or 70 people might have gone up the trail and down the trail. Well, 10 mountain bikers a day is 3,600 mountain bike routes down a year. And that 60 to 70 people is 10,000 people. And that's just one trail. So we got to the point where, unfortunately, as that increased numbers was starting to become, larger and larger, I would say 10 years ago, some of the studies that were done, it was maybe 250,000. We've doubled that easily. All you have to do is go to one trail and count the numbers. And even if you only went for the morning, you'd probably get up to 250,000 people if they didn't go in the afternoon at all. And at the same time, the numbers were increasing. A lot of the agencies' care for them was decreasing, and it wasn't because they didn't care about them. I mean, county parks, for instance, is really an urban park system. It really isn't designed to focus on trails that would be in a more mountainous kind of environment. the Forest Service has just become increasingly a firefighting agency, to the point that, I remember during, I think, the Gap Fire, or maybe the Sheriff of Fire, meeting the forest supervisor out on one of the little turnouts along the Gaviota coast, and he was telling people that in the Santa Barbara Los Padres forest area, which stretches from Monterey down all the way almost to Highway 5 and down through Ojai, had 39 employees only that were non-fire. Every other employee had a relationship to fire. So the reality is that fires, become a dominant force in Santa Barbara, and that's really made it very difficult for the Forest Service to handle things. And meanwhile, Santa Barbara City has a lot of responsibilities, but they gave those to the Forest Service historically because, excuse me, at that time the forest was more capable. They had, even if they had seasonal fire crews in the summer, they had money to turn them over, and they would work all winter on recreational things. So they had the opportunity, they had the young guys, the strong guys, the guys that had all of this, a lot of the same tools and capabilities you would use on a fire. You also can transition right over to dealing with trail maintenance kind of thing. So it was just a natural fit until fire started draining the resources and the budget and recreation started getting lower. And then, about the same time, it became more and more expensive to live in Santa Barbara and very difficult to maintain the people. So having a rec officer, when one would leave, it might not be easy to get the next one.
So, all right. So I see that trend that you're talking about there.
Yeah. So we started transitioning towards a number of the nonprofit organizations that people recognize now, like Montecito Trails Foundation,
Okay.
Los Padres Forest Association, Santa Barbara Trails Council, and the mountain bike group that was called Santa Barbara Mountain Bike Trail Volunteers. It's now called Sage Trails Alliance. All started contributing a lot, but they're all individual nonprofits, and we really never had an overall management system for the trails, where the agencies were not only taking responsibility, but they were actually fitting that nonprofit stuff, which is a perfect complement if you have an overall management structure. But the Forest Service didn't have the people to do it because they didn't have a rec officer. The county was really focused much more on its urban parks. The city of Santa Barbara really never was involved, to a certain extent not involved, because there are obviously places like Parma and some of the more local areas that you might go hiking, but they own 25 or 30% of the trails in the Santa Barbara front country, and they've never maintained them because the Forest Service did them. So they don't have the crews or the expertise to do it either. So you have this kind of interesting mix here where you've got the agencies which have basically ceded the role that they should be doing to all these individual groups, but they're not coordinated. To a certain extent, they talk to each other and so forth, but they're not really, terribly coordinated. Some of the groups don't have the level of expertise that other groups have and so forth. So we really need to get back to at least starting with trying to get these agencies to come together and begin working on some kind of process to be able to take some of that high-level management stuff and get it in place so that they have an umbrella that these nonprofits and others can work through. In an ideal world, you wouldn't be dependent on volunteers for everything. But in the real world here, they do all of the work on the trails. Whether it's volunteer things, whether the individual groups raise money to hire crews and things like that, they take care of the trails. So what we ought to be able to do is at least have the agencies come up with some kind of umbrella structure and do their part so that they have some kind of management control over how things are going. And that's the kind of stuff I'm trying to talk to the different agencies about, getting more involved with, it's a tough sell because they don't have money for anything, let alone something that, that they should have been doing but haven't been doing. And where do you come up with it when you've got all these other issues, homelessness being one of the really huge ones, dealing with wildfire and protection and so forth. There are big issues for them, to deal with. So it's an ongoing struggle to see how we can get there, but I'm hoping we will.
So does anyone else see the need for this coordination?
I think that everybody does.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I sat down with Jill Zachary, the director for City Parks and Recreation. She absolutely agrees that we need to do some of this stuff, but at the same time, she has her hands full with all the things that you've got to deal with parks within the city boundaries, let alone to go out and deal with some of these other things. Doesn't mean that she might not want to be involved, but then you start looking at how do you create a legal structure, if you're talking about just the front country, that a federal agency, a county agency, and an individual city can create that will allow them to do some kind of management oversight.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of bureaucratic components that you might call big hurdles, along the way, but it's one of those things that you got to keep working at, because at some point in time, and one of the things I keep saying to people, at some point in time, because of the increases in storm damage and impacts from fire and things like that, that we are at the point where those nonprofits may not be able to handle the kind of maintenance that's required. And a simple part of that is just looking at some of the damage in the most recent, there's major slides on San Isidro Trail, major on the old Romero Road that goes up to the top, the crest. And we're talking about repairs that, typically a while ago when I was doing a lot of the work, 10 and 15 years ago, we might be talking about $5,000 to $15,000. We're talking about $100,000 to $200,000, $300,000 for some of these. And we just did similar things to repair almost the exact same set of trails after the Thomas Fire and the debris flow and so forth. So we're only, and then there have been 2 or 3 major storms in between that, and then this really countywide catastrophic set of impacts from the winter storms this year, and that's in a 5-year period of time. In the past we might be talking about, go back, the 1995 floods or the 2005 floods or something like that. Or if we go way back, the 1978 was a huge, year for floods. I think it's still the record for annual rainfall in Santa Barbara, like 42 inches. Wow. So we used to talk about these in every decade or so. Now we're talking about them every year or so. Oh, gosh. And the impacts are pretty, staggering. So we need to have a system. We can't afford not to have a system in place. That's not to talk about things like safety. If you have people out there maintaining trails who are not, there are no qualifications for trail work. Depending on the agency, you may or may not need a contractor's license. For most of the work that's done in Santa Barbara front country areas, done by people without contractor's licenses because they're not required. Now, and part of that is because a lot of the trails have either are on the forest land, or like with the city, they gave an easement to the Forest Service, and the Forest Service doesn't require contractor licenses. The city does for certain kinds of things. So you don't necessarily have people that are technically qualified. I mean, they have ground level experience qualifications. So when you're starting to talk about liability issues, and the agencies, they've willingly, more or less, given a lot of these liability potential issues to the nonprofits, without the oversight, and management. Yeah. So there's the potential for, issues other than just the fact that, they may not have done the world's greatest job doing, trail clearance or whatever, when everybody else look at it and say, well, thank God we got some done, because otherwise we had none. So everybody's appreciative of it all, but it's still placing, resources in play with organizations that have very, very well-intentioned organizations, which in the case of groups like Montecito Foundation can raise a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an organization, as an example, that is run by people with the highest level of intentions and the least level of actual trail experience or knowledge about how to maintain trails. And they're dependent on those that they hire, so I think things need to change, and I think the agencies need to be part of that.
So several of these agencies welcome volunteers, do they?
Most do. The Montecito Trails Foundation doesn't. They've changed a little bit. I haven't talked to them more recently, but they had some negative experiences with some lawsuits that date back, to a certain extent, and I'm sure you've been around, either had the experiences or been around people where you might start to do something and you have a bad experience, and even though that one bad experience was just one bad experience, it basically can you make decisions as if it just was everyone in the future is going to happen to.
Yeah.
Well, they had a few times where they got lawsuits that were probably not really lawsuits that should have gone anywhere, but it soured them on the use of volunteers. Instead, they focused on raising the money so they could hire groups. So they're primarily a trail resource for hiring both the Sage Trails Alliance and the Los Padres Forest Association. Both have fairly well-trained crews. So they're the primarily ones that people go to when they've raised money and they want to hire. Santa Barbara Trails Council is another one that raises a lot of money too. And it goes to hiring these groups to do trail work.
Okay. So it seems that I've read about various agencies wanting volunteers and people actually volunteering. So if somebody's watching this and they want to volunteer to help with the trails or whatever, would they call the individual agencies to see if they take volunteers?
So Montecito Trails Foundation kind of got off in why they don't there, but the Trails Council, Forest Association, Sage Trails Alliance all welcome volunteers. They have sign-ups. So the Trails Council is sbtrails.org. The Forest Service is lpforest.org. Sage Trails Alliance is sagetrails.org, I think, but Sage Trails Alliance. And then Montecito Trails Foundation is, I think, Montecito Trails Foundation something else. But any one of those names you could search, and get them easily. All three of the more others have ways for signing up to be volunteers and things like that. And then most of them have newsletters or ways of off their listservs to let people know when things are happening and so forth. And they mostly organize their own, but they also together do a series of trail stays. So there's one, around Earth Day, there's a National Trails Day, there's a State Trails Day, and so forth. So there are a few dates where everybody kind of gets together and coordinates, and they choose some places that they want to do work on that particular day. And so it's like the three key ones are right around Earth Day, the first or the second week in June, the end of September. Those are all national and state trails days, and then Earth Day, kinds of things. But there aren't any regular ones. There isn't an agency coordinated process with its own volunteer thing and so forth. So there's no central place you can go. And that's one of the things that I'm working on with changing some of my website things so that we can do a more concentrated thing that everybody can buy into that the agents can use as an oversight, process. And then we can have a volunteer program as part of that, and then start to look at training people to be, the leaders and so forth.
Wow.
So we'll see how that all works out, but that's part of, I think, what we need to do is, and that's like a key component, which I'm glad you brought up the idea of volunteers, to the idea of the agencies coordinating, because it's not just being able to have a management structure as far as really, helping support the volunteer stuff. It's also having that ability to have a central place that you can come for information about the trails. So if you went, for instance, to want to figure out where a trail was open at, because most of the trails in the front country, after the last of the big storms, closed.
Yes.
And the basic structure of closures is if the Forest Service closes things and the city agencies all feed into the forest system, they close all the trails too. So basically for about 2 or 3 months, all of the trails were closed in the front country. So how do you know, you would, you're a mountain biker, you go to this one, you're a forest guy, you go to this one, you go to the Trails Council one. You're trying to figure out which is the right place to go for the information. Meanwhile, how do you find it on the county site? You got to go to county parks, then you got to look for where's there something about trails and so forth. And then if you assume the information is correct, but in some cases changed without the agencies taking the time to change it from closed to open and stuff. So we need to have a central place with information about each trail, and then a map where you can immediately see by looking at it, if somebody goes in and here's the list of trails in the database and it's open, close, anything that's open is a segment that shows on the map as green. Anything that's closed is in red. Then you could have a caution, in yellow, and a caution could be a point of danger, and if you click on that, you would find out what the danger is. So for instance, you might have a section of trail that was with caution, safe for hikers to go by, but maybe extreme caution if you're a mountain biker, and impossible to pass if you're an equestrian. Which you can get trails narrowed down to a point where, let's just say the trail's 2 feet wide. Well, a horse just can't get by on that if you've got a steep hillside. A hiker who's careful could. So we need something like that, and part of it is that we need to have trusted information that the agencies can count on, and then at the same point, we can also in there have that centralized volunteer system. We can have all of the projects that are upcoming from the different groups. So if you would say, well, dang, I just was up on this trail and I just did a report on it, because you could go into that same site and post a user trail report and saying problem here or something like that. And meanwhile, you would get information right there. Hey, we scheduled a project, to go up and work on that section 2 weeks from now, and people know. Or you can, on the other hand, go out and look and say, hey, what got done here and who did it? Because I want to, and if that stuff's all posted, you go like, oh, wow, this group's doing all this work. I'm going to put some money into that group. So.
That's we are so lucky that you see that discrepancy and that need for coordination, and you're trying to do something about it. So, hooray for you. Let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about wildfires in Santa Barbara County. That's a big concern. And so tell us your thoughts on that, and maybe what we as residents can do to be more responsible.
Well, I wrote an article for Newshawk about a month or so ago on.
I read that.
Basically, just reminding people that flashy fuels, in most cases meaning grass, are ready. It's a fire ready to happen at the first mistake somebody makes, and people make a lot of mistakes when it comes to being careless with, whether it's using, having a barbecue pit on the ground and somebody kicks it over and the coals scatter into the grass. Somebody's got a grinder too close, and sparks fly. Somebody goes out and works on trails with tools that got metal blades. Somebody's out there mowing their field with with a mower that has a metal blade and they hit a rock. Anything that, and a car, you've parked off the road, I'm sure, many a times and never thought that much about, well, a lot of the little turnouts got a lot of grass around the edges of them. Never think about, well, what if I go out into one of those and I maybe go a little bit too close and there's heat underneath? It's somebody smoking. I mean, you can come up with all kinds of ways that people can start fires. And if you aren't careful, then, you can have a major fire. And the biggest example, and I really looked at one, I ironically called the Ray fire, R-E-Y fire. Yeah. In that article, it was one of those interesting things, which is a combination of an old oak tree along Paradise Road, along the river, falls over. One of the branches hits a power line. The power line goes down in sparks. And this happens to be a White Rock campground, or picnic area. The sparks hit the grass. The wind just came up and it blows the fire across the river. Starts up what's called Sage Hill, which is behind that area there, into San Fernando Ray Ranch. And that fire goes to the west and threatens all the area behind Lake Kachuma. And then it goes to the east and burns all the way past Gibraltar Reservoir and came within a whisker of making a turn and cutting across the river and going with the backside. That would have been into Montecito if that had happened. So it's all from the start of one thing. Another fire called the Whittier Fire, which is one of the whatever you call the camps. There's Boy Scout camps and there's other kinds of outdoor school and so forth. Well, Whittier Camp is one of them that's the closest to 154 and right across from the entrance, more or less, to Lake Kachuma. Okay. Somebody working on their car near the grass. Don't know the details, but they were working on the car and started the fire. Burns up, comes within a shadow of burning out one of the camps further up in the canyon there. They had to do a serious rescue to get the kids out of there.
Oh, there were kids there.
And then it moved to the east and burned pretty much the whole outdoor school, burned out. And then in 4 hours, it went across the foothills towards San Marcos Pass and came over the top of Winchester Canyon. And by that evening, the fire started around noon. By that evening, there was fire going over Winchester Canyon. Fortunately, the onshore winds, rather than having you can picture if on that day there had been a sundowner effect come over Winchester. It's a fairly large saddle, that's right behind Winchester Canyon. If that had come down there, we would have had that gone all the way through all of the homes and structures down there, right at the end of Cathedral, where Cathedral Road comes over. So that's just simple ways. And that fire, was 4 hours more or less from starting by Lake Kachuma and burning east across and coming up the backside, and a few hours later it was over, there. So any one of these fires has the potential of creating serious, serious consequences in the front country, and loss of homes and fortunately, for the most part, not a loss of lives. Although we've lost a few, in the past fires in the early 70s, and then one or two, I think maybe one for sure, but maybe two in the paint fire in 1991. So it's really critical that people think about these kind of things. And both of those fires that I'm talking about are ones that went through major areas with grass. I mean, the grass. And we had, in that particular spring, in both cases, I think, fairly large late spring rains. So if we're talking about weeds, they're thigh-high weeds. Well, they're thigh-high, dry, non-native grasses, basically. And with a little bit of wind, it just blows right through it. They go up over a ridge, and then you just got this stuff going out, and all of the coals starting little spot fires and things like that. So it's a really serious situation. We have been very lucky so far this summer that we haven't had major sundowners. Sundowners The more predominant sundowners tend to be in the spring, according to the people that know, and I'm not sure what it is, and then lesser ones in the fall. The key about the ones in the springtime in the general past is that when they occur is the period where generally the fuel moisture is the highest. Oh. So it's less, well, and maybe maybe some of the weed growth isn't as high. The grasses maybe are still a little green, especially on the shade sides of things. So it's more difficult for a fire to get going. Oh. Although the Hayesacita fire, May 5th, that proved not to be the case. 2 guys out there with metal blades on weed whackers, cutting work, brushing on the Hayesacita trail, and starting a little fire that turned into some kind of ember pie, and then just sat there until the winds picked up later, and then started moving that fire further. So they were probably home having lunch.
They never even knew.
And never even knew that, that they had started that, And so just the bottom line is that grass is an incredible carrier of fire, and we have to be super careful. We've been lucky this summer, but we're now at the period of time where we can get general sundowner events coming up, and now maybe this last rain, maybe it'll make a difference. It's hard to know how much chaparral can suck in moisture from an individual event, like what we just had with the with the hurricane that came our way. But we have much lower humidities, much lower potential fuel moisture. Generally speaking, really hot temperatures through the backcountry. I mean, you may look at it here in Santa Barbara and, today was a nice day. We finally got 73 out. Well, try going to Santa Ynez and find out that's 97. Oh, yeah. In some of these areas. So, most of the country, we're sheltered to a certain extent being along the coast. And so a lot of that interior still has all of those qualities that make for fire to start and spread. And we just have to make sure that people know that they got to be about as careful as they could ever have been, not to be the one that does it.
So, do you think we've been having more fires than in the past, or is it kind of hard to measure that?
We haven't necessarily had more fires. I mean, if you go back and you look at, the Forest Service records go back to around 1900, and for quite a while in that period of time, I don't know how accurate the boundaries and the numbers are, because if you go through and you overlap all of the fire history, you pretty much see that everything that's got topography, foothills, mountains, and so forth have burned. Oh. Generally speaking, they don't burn down into the valley areas. They don't burn down into areas where you get more immediate response. I mean, if you can get fire trucks on the edge of Cathedral Oaks, theoretically, a lot of the times you're going to be able to stop things. And the same thing is true out in the valley and so forth. It's just when those things happen and there are no roads and you're dependent on air resources, it's very difficult to put them out. So if you take all of that fire history, you'll see everything's pretty much burned that has any topography. Part of it is that's where the chaparral is growing thickest. You can't get to it easily in terms of putting fires out. And with topography, fires go uphill 2 to 3 times faster than it goes downhill. So if you take something at the start of, say, the Santa Ynez River and it's burning up the canyon and burning up the side channels, that's all uphill fire. And then if you get other places like Santa Barbara where you've got the high pressure shifts, so it's higher pressure in the valley, lower pressure in the coast, then you have it coming over in some places and then pushing down. But generally speaking, a lot of Santa Barbara County is difficult to defend against because of how rugged it is and how inaccessible it is. And you have to add to the fact too that you can't there's just all kinds of places you can't put resources on foot. It's just too dangerous. And they've got figures for how big of a defensible space that you have to have, and you get into 50 and 60 foot flames, and you're talking about having about a 400 foot diameter,
wow,
space, to protect yourself against if that comes from different directions and so forth. And there aren't places like that in the backcountry. There are a few small places, but you don't have the ability to put people in, and so forth. So
so I've got one last question. We don't have much time left, but I'm dying to ask you this question. I feel like we could talk all day. It's just fascinating listening to you. So I've heard you refer several times to front country, back country, and maybe you could just quickly, in a nutshell, tell us what's the difference.
Well, first of all, I think different people would have different ideas of what exactly it is. But generally speaking, I think the front country is defined primarily by the San Ynez Mountains. So from our perspective here, I mean, if you think about, when did the first people come, on horseback, the De Anza or the other expeditions that came along and so forth, they had no way to get over the mountains, for the most part. I mean, and you go to eventually to the railroad that was built was 100 years ago, automobiles 100 years ago and where could they go? On roads. So you basically had the front country area, eventually a road up to to the Gaviota, and then you had the San Ynez Valley, and that was pretty much much for until the 60s and 70s. I mean, I don't know what people would think of the valley today if they didn't have a Cold Springs Bridge across. Oh gosh! Because I come back from the days when you had to do the old road past the tavern, and out and to the valley. So you had about 45 minutes to your drive, going that way, and so forth. So basically, it's just dividing out the areas that are inhabited. So I think in today's world, you can consider the valley. So it's really what's behind Lake Kachuma, and then from behind Santa Barbara all the way over to Cuyama Valley. It's the roadless areas in the most rugged parts of the county, and that's about 70% of the county.
Wow.
So
my gosh, Ray.
Yeah, I'd say if you take and overlay roads, or get a county map out and look at them, and you see in the around Santa Barbara crisscross roads all over, Valley crisscross roads, Santa Maria, Lompoc, so forth, and then you look behind Lake Kachuma, and you look from, if you know where Tepesquay Canyon is, and then 166 on this way, and then you go over to Highway 33, and tell me how many roads you can find. There are a few dirt roads that the Forest Service uses for management, but it's basically all that roadless, area that most people have never been to in Santa Barbara and ought to. If nothing else, I suggest that go to the top of Figueroa Mountain to the lookout there and look. I mean, that is, you've got a probably 270-degree panorama of what the backcountry is, from there, So I'd encourage people to start thinking about finding out how to get over those mountains and explore more of it.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
And thank you for all of your work coordinating the efforts for the trails and for all those great articles. I read every one of your articles. They're just fascinating. And I think on my bookshelf, I have that Santa Barbara Day Hikes book that you...
48 pages.
Yep, that's it.
Picture of Rattlesnake Canyon on the front cover in black and white. And that lasted for a while, and then I had the good fortune of picking up a publisher that wanted to do larger volumes. But my early one, I think, and I'm not remembering Penny's last, not Penny Davies from Earthling, but Chaucer's Bookstore sponsored a lot of my early success, and were very, very helpful in getting me going. And Earthling picked up after that, and then eventually I had my own publisher along the way.
Well, thank you for all you do.
You're welcome.
Everything you do that benefits all of us. We appreciate you coming on our show today and telling us all about it.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. It's fun. So anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us on 805 Focus, and we'll see you next time.